Thanks for joining in today. And my name is David Rogers. I'm the CNPS lead pilot for Cessna and Gulfstream. Today's topic is essentially tips and tricks for the FMS. The challenge with that is I had to pick a platform, and unfortunately I can't cover this across every platform that's out there. So I chose the Primus Epic, and most of the screen captures you're going to see are off of the Citation Sovereign. But having said that, if you're on an older NZ series or just a different version of FMS, you're still going to find that a lot of the functionality we're going to talk about today will work for you, maybe not all. So the first thing we're going to do is dive into a couple of hot topics, and the first one is around a new piece of functionality that came with FMS 7.1. Operators who upgraded to CERT Foxtrot in the Gulfstream, Phase 5 in the Sovereign, or Load 20 for Hawker Beach that have ILS auto-tune capability, we're going to talk about a couple of tips to make sure that the system works for you the way it was intended. The ILS auto-tune is designed so that when the pilot selects an approach, that's an ILS, obviously, the system will automatically select the preview mode for short-range navigation. It'll then set the appropriate inbound course in the preview window, and it will also tune the appropriate frequency for that approach procedure. A couple of triggers that have to be met for this function to work correctly, and the first one is, and this is usually the biggest problem when pilots don't see it working correctly, is that the aircraft has to be within 75 miles flight plan distance, meaning all the waypoints in the flight plan less than 75 miles, and 30 miles direct distance from the destination airport before it will go into the ILS auto-tune functions. Once that trigger is met, the pilot action is just to allow the system to auto-generate the preview needle, and then it will set the inbound course when it generates the preview needle, and then the pilot will be able to auto-transition from long-range to short-range nav and auto-capture the ILS. Some basic do's and don'ts. The first one is to ensure that auto-tune is enabled, and this is fairly basic, but I've had a couple of people who weren't completely familiar with it, so we'll talk about it here. To make sure that auto-tune is selected, press the progress key, and on progress page 1, you'll notice next to the fifth row, next to line select keys 5 left and right, you'll see some blue letters and the nav frequencies that are currently tuned. The blue letter that should be displayed there should be a cyan letter A, and that means that the system is auto-tuning. If that's not displayed, you'll notice the bullets there on the screen. You need to verify that FMS is your selected nav source on the PFD. Press the delete key on the MCDU, and then press the line select key, either 5 left or 5 right, whichever one needs to be transitioned to auto-tune. And when you complete those steps, you should see the cyan letter A next to it, meaning auto-tune is enabled. You can also verify this on the radio page in either of the NAV1 or NAV2 boxes. If auto-tune is enabled, you'll see the letters FMS Auto appear within the window. Some other do's and don'ts for the auto-tune functionality. Do not press the preview key before or after loading an approach in the MCDU. The reason for that is the system is designed to auto-populate the preview needle at those mileages we talked about earlier, and then to set the inbound course. But if you've already pressed the preview key and have a preview needle displayed, the system is designed not to override a pilot input. So in other words, you're going to disable the system by activating it yourself. And then, as we mentioned, load the approach in the MCDU. Wait until you reach the mileages we've already talked about. Be careful with certain arrivals at airports where an arrival can service multiple directions of landing traffic. For example, let's say you're going to be landing at an airport where the arrival brings you in from the north, but can also bring you in, around to the south if they're landing the opposite direction. Sometimes additional waypoints within those arrivals will build your flight plan distance in excess of 75 nautical miles, and that'll keep the system from populating the auto-tune or populating the preview needle. If that happens, you can delete those excessive waypoints out of there if you want to make the system work, or if you're not comfortable doing that, you can just go back and do it manually. The other change with the ILS auto-tune mode is that you must capture from the nav mode, with FMS being the active nav source. So what that means is, even if you're being vectored onto an ILS in heading mode, you'll have to select the nav mode and capture like an extended center line. And then once you're in nav and nav is captured, you can arm the approach mode. And as the localizer comes alive, it will transition from long range to short range nav and capture the ILS and glide slope at that time. But you have to be in FMS with nav mode selected before arming the approach. It won't work from heading to approach, which we all know is the typical way that we've done it in the past. The next thing that we'll talk about is another function that came with FMS 7.1, and that is auto LNAV for go-around. This is actually a really cool feature, and what it does is when an airplane is on an approach, and let's just use an ILS for example, and for some reason you end up having to miss the approach. We all know that there's a lot of shuffling and confusion that takes place in the cockpit between trying to reconfigure the aircraft and get the aircraft tracking on an appropriate mode of automation, and this actually eliminates some of that workload. What it does is it automatically, when we push TOGA now, if you have the auto LNAV for go-around in the new software versions, when you push TOGA, it will automatically switch back to long-range navigation and enable the nav mode at the same time, so it will start you on the published missed approach procedure. So that's a big workload reducer, because then all the pilots have to do is basically clean up the gear and the flaps, and the aircraft is going in the proper direction. However, a couple of little gotchas here that you just need to be aware of, and that is if you're being vectored onto an ILS and the crew has done this, what I call now the old way, meaning you switch to green needles and set the inbound course yourself, and you're now flying heading select towards the course, in the event that you don't advance the legs of the FMS onto the approach, when you select TOGA, the system is not going to work correctly. It's still going to switch to a magenta needle, but because you're not on the active leg for the missed approach, it won't start you on the missed, and it'll just go into roll mode. So that could cause a little bit of confusion in the cockpit. And so the key here is just to remember to sequence the FMS, just like we should do normally, onto the active leg prior to starting down an ILS or any other approach. We're going to go through just a little bit of background that hopefully we can build upon as we go further into the presentation. One of the topics I'm going to touch on is the flight configuration section of the FMS. This is a section that the pilot can access through the nav menu, and you'll see the steps up at the top of the slide. By pressing the nav key, next button to go to the second page, there'll be a maintenance prompt. Again, next button to go to the second page. The setup prompt that you see on the screen capture at 6 left. And then there'll be a flight configuration option. We'll take you to the flight config page. This basically allows the crew to set up a number of customizable configurations within the FMS. And the reason I mention this is one of the things that happens anytime you do a software upgrade. So if you just recently went to Cert Foxtrot or Phase 5 or whatever load that you might have upgraded to, this typically all gets reset and set back to a default. So it will hold through power cycles, but if you do a software upgrade, it typically resets. And I get a lot of phone calls from people that think that we have removed functionality. And in fact, it's just something you need to go back into and basically turn it back on. So we're going to talk about those real quick because a lot of people aren't even familiar that it's there. So once you've gone through the steps to get to the flight config section, the first field that you're going to see is bank factor. Bank factor allows you to basically tell the FMS what bank angle you want it to use for turns. So in other words, if you have, let's say, what we call nervous flyers, the people that like to have the most stabilized flight possible, and you want to try to have it use a lower bank angle. The default, by the way, is 7 degrees, but you could set that to 3, 4, or 5 degrees, and the FMS will try to lead the turns earlier and use that shallower bank angle for passenger comfort. It will override the bank factor anytime it needs to stay within protected airspace, so you don't need to worry about that. On the flip side of that, if you've got a 7-degree bank factor in, occasionally people will see that the FMS may not make the crisp turn right onto a center line of a course, and then it may do a series of shallow S-turns while it tries to bracket and find the right heading. Some people have found that if they go to a higher bank factor, the 15-degree bank angle, that it tends to intercept and capture the course a little more crisply. So that's the bank factor. The next item on is flight plan auto page. This is a really subtle change, but basically with flight plan auto page on, when you're loading a flight plan and you get to the last VIA 2 prompt and you fill it in, it just automatically advances to the next page and puts another blank VIA 2 in front of you, and it just continuously rolls forward. If this is turned off, then when you put in your last waypoint, you'll have to hit the next button to physically or to manually advance to the next page. The origin and destination display, when this is turned on, the FMS will normally display the closest airports on the MFD. When this is selected on, it will always display the origin and destination airports in that list, even if they're not the closest airports. And if you turn it off, it just simply won't display the origin and destination as part of that list. Special missions, this is a function that most people leave off. And in this case, when you go to the pattern page, you'll normally see the option for holds, procedure turns, and flyover waypoints. If you turn special missions on, it will allow you to add functionality for orbits and radials as well. Function key paging just means that instead of having to use the next key to toggle through, we can continue to press the same function key. For example, if we're on page 1 of our active flight plan of 8, if function key paging is on, we can just continue to press the flight plan key, and that will advance through our pages as if we were pressing the next key. The next option is flight summary output. When flight summary output is selected, this allows us to determine once we land, there's a flight summary page that's generated, and we can either select this to be displayed on the MCDU, to the printer if we have one, or to the data loader to be taken off aircraft, or any combination therein. The last option that you'll see here is the temperature compensation configuration. If you're in an aircraft that's equipped with temp comp, you can configure this for off, hot, cold, or again, any combination within the OR prompt. However, as I mentioned earlier, this slide deck was developed using a sovereign MCDU. Sovereigns do display the temp comp configuration. However, that functionality didn't make it in under Phase 5, so it will show the option, but it's grayed out, and there actually is no pilot input available there. Let's talk briefly about FMS databases, and we'll tie this together here in just a minute. There are typically 3 databases included in the FMS, and those are the nav database, custom database, and the aircraft database. The nav database is the database that's updated on the 28-day cycle, and typically it contains the information that the aircraft uses to navigate from point to point. That information is information like airports, runways, SID stars, nav aids, ILSs, airways, waypoints, etc. When that information is disseminated by Honeywell on that 28-day cycle, it is loaded onto the aircraft, and the FMS is capable of actually holding 2 databases at the same time, and that's so that if you're actually out on the road and the aircraft isn't going to be able to be accessed during that time, you can preload a database, and the system will automatically load the active database when power is applied. So the current cycle should automatically be selected, and if neither database is current, actually what will happen, contrary to the picture, is both databases will appear in amber along with the scratch pad message that will say database out of date. The next database that we're going to talk about is called the custom database. The custom database is not updated, and that's because this is basically what I would call a sandbox for the pilot. In other words, anything that the pilot inputs that is going to be stored on the FMS is done in this custom database. And you'll see on the bullets to the right, it can store 3,000 stored flight plans, 1,000 pilot-defined waypoints. But the type of stuff that gets stored in here are the things that you see under the red bullets there. Anytime you store a flight plan, enter a pilot-defined waypoint, or create a temporary waypoint. What's a temporary waypoint? A point-bearing distance, point-bearing, anything like that creates what's called a temporary waypoint in the custom database. The third database that we'll talk about is the aircraft database, and this is essentially the performance parameters that the aircraft uses to calculate time, fuel, information like that, and if the aircraft is equipped with TOLD, it also will generate that TOLD capability. We'll talk a little bit about FMS operational modes and hopefully combine some of this information now and make it make a little bit of sense. There are basically 4 different modes that the FMS can operate in, dual for dual installations, or if your aircraft is equipped with more than 2 FMSs, you may see synchronous there. But essentially, the top 2 modes that you see, dual and a NIT transfer, are both what we'll consider normal modes. And then the lower 2, independent and single, are both what we'll call abnormal or degraded modes, meaning that something isn't consistent between both FMSs, and as a result, it is not synchronizing information. In the dual operation, the data between both FMSs is synchronized, meaning if I go direct to a point on the left MCDU, the right side will copy that information over if I'm in dual. In this case, it uses what's called a master-slave relationship, where the master FMS is the one that is selected on the electronic display system, and the slave FMS then copies over what it sees from the master FMS. During dual operations, the list that you see is automatically transferred between FMSs, which includes your active flight plan data, your performance inputs, pilot-defined waypoints, stored flight plans, and offside radio tuning. In order for dual to be the active mode, the following requirements all have to be met. The FMSs have to be running the identical software version. The FMSs each individually generate their own position, and those positions have to agree within 10 nautical miles, or dual won't be able to be achieved. Now, the third bullet I'm going to spend a minute on because this is actually capable of generating a lot of problems. The custom database has to be identical between both FMSs. And why wouldn't the custom database be identical? Well, On a lot of aircraft platforms, and the Sovereign's a great example, when aircraft power is applied before the avionics are turned on, a lot of aircraft will power up one FMS for flight planning. If you either store a flight plan or create a temporary waypoint, anything that we mentioned earlier that can be stored in that custom database, now when the second FMS is brought online through avionics power, it's going to see a discrepancy between the custom databases. And on the picture there where you see the selected mode dual, the active mode will actually be degraded to independent, and there'll be a problems prompt next to 5 right. And we'll talk about how to resolve that here in just a few minutes. The nav database has to be identical. The offside FMS status has to be okay. Configuration pins have to match, and the master-slave status all has to be identified in order for dual to be achieved. The second normal mode of operation is what we'll call initiated or init transfer. I always make the joke that whether you operate in dual or init transfer depends on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. In dual, we make the change and assume that everything's going to work out okay. In init transfer, we make the change on one FMS, but it doesn't automatically cross-fill to the other side until we do a pilot action. And that pilot action is going to always be found on the last page, where there'll be a pilot input required to transfer either from FMS 2 or to FMS number 2 once we're satisfied with the input we've seen on the FMS we made the change to. Now let's talk about degraded modes. The next lower mode of operation is called independent mode. In independent mode, only the offside radio tuning commands are transferred automatically. So in other words, the FMSs are both operating independently. The only requirements for independent mode to be active is that the FMS has to be operating on the same software version and have the same configuration pins. Some possible conditions that could cause the FMS to not be able to maintain dual, or if the positions don't agree within 10 miles, the offside FMS is not okay, or you'll see that third bullet, the customer nav database don't agree. So if one database was either corrupted, or if we had that issue where we had saved something on one FMS when the other side wasn't powered in the custom database, then we're going to have a problem, and we'll talk about how to correct that here in just a sec. The lowest operating mode with a dual FMS installation is single. In single, the FMSs are completely separated and no data is transferred between them. In order to see what mode is selected and active, you can go through the nav index page 2, and you'll see the maintenance prompt that's highlighted at the bottom of the screen. And then from that, on the right-hand side, you'll see the picture that shows the active and selected mode. Anytime you have a different mode that is active from what you had selected, there'll be a problems prompt at 5 right. The problems prompt, if selected, will tell us what it is that's causing the FMSs to be separated. What I've seen a lot of pilots do is when they look at the selected mode as dual and they see the active mode as single, as is the case here, they'll go to that OR prompt at 2 right and they'll reselect dual. And what gets really entertaining is I'll watch them do it over and over, expecting to see a different result. So in our case, the highlight here where you see the blue box under problems is where you need to go. And in this case, it tells us that this would be a pretty obvious example. FMS number 2 is in op, and that's the reason it's separated. But you might also see a common thing there, which would be custom DB, if we had that custom database discrepancy that we mentioned earlier. In the event that that happens, you have the ability through the data load prompt down at 6 left, and through that you'll have the ability to transfer custom databases to sync the 2 up again, and after that you should be able to achieve dual mode. So having done some background, let's move on and talk a little bit about basic flight planning. We're going to cover a lot of functionality today, from little things to some more advanced features, and hopefully everyone will take something away from this. One of the first things is when you first load a flight plan in, the origin is auto-populated after we do our position initialization. One of the things that very few people are aware of, but if you haven't noticed it, it's been there all along, is the label under origin says origin slant ETD for estimated time of departure. When we fill in a flight plan, the system automatically starts to tell us how many minutes in between waypoints as it's building the flight plan. If we actually put in a slant with our estimated time that we're going to depart, it will actually then calculate times at each waypoint, and it will give us a time at destination. Now, that's not a huge thing, but it's a nice feature. But the other benefit to doing this is that when you do that, it automatically goes in and does a predictive rain check. So if we're going to an airport where we plan on shooting a GPS approach, it will now go in and do the predictive rain check and tell us if predictive rain is unavailable, as opposed to us having to do it as a pilot action later on. Once we build our basic flight plan and we move into performance initialization or perf-init, one of the first things that I mention to people is on perf-init, typically page 4, depending on your platform, where we have the cruise winds at altitude entry. Most pilots or flight departments that I've seen tend to leave this blank, and they don't really see the value to it. And typically in smaller airplanes that fly the shorter legs, it may not be as big a deal, but it is a good feature to get in the habit of putting in there, and I'll explain why. If you leave this blank on the ground, the system doesn't have any winds to use, so all the flight planning is going to be based on zero wind, which could obviously give us bad results. Once we put this in, the system actually uses a model, which we'll look at, and based on what we've done, it will actually blend the entered winds versus the sensed winds, and the further ahead of the airplane we go, the more it's going to rely on the entered winds. So again, if we leave it blank, if we're doing a transcon to the west with a strong headwind and we leave this blank, we may find ourselves getting short on fuel and taking a lot longer to get to our destination. So here's an example of the wind and temp model that I mentioned earlier. At our present position, the aircraft will use 100% of the sensed wind in the blending. But if we go 200 miles ahead of our current position, the model is now 50% sensed and the other 50% from pilot entered. So you can see the value to putting an input in here. And at 400 miles out, that ratio is reversed even further. So now the blend is only 20% sensed and 80% entered, and it continues further and further downstream to rely more and more heavily on the entered wind. So if you're not doing that, or if you're not data linking your winds, that's a good habit to get into. And as a matter of fact, even if you data link your winds into the flight plan, it still won't use anything between takeoff and that first point that's data linked. So it's still never a bad idea to put entered winds in there, and it will still blend those in. Even if you enter your own winds, it'll still blend them in with the data linked winds. So always a good thing. The next topic is more of a soapbox topic, so I'll hit it briefly. But I recommend to people, because we get in the habit of going through the perf pages and we know what the pilot input requirements are, that we typically do it so quickly that it looks like a quick keystroke, next, and then a confirm. Periodically, I recommend to people, check the values that are supposed to be saved through power cycles. The basic operating weight's a great example. I've seen numerous aircraft where people have flown it, use erroneous data for long periods of time, where they got a software update and it reset to like a factory number for a BOW, or there was something entered incorrectly at some time, they just carried it over. Obviously, an incorrect BOW is going to mean that all the calculations can be off, which means speeds, landing distances, all the performance information, if it's garbage in, will be garbage out. So periodically check that, just like you change the batteries on your smoke detector, check the basic operating weight. The next area that we'll touch on is a really interesting thing. For years, when I would go to our training provider, it seemed like all instructors loved to give me the same scenario, and that was usually something along the lines of they would program the sim to simulate a fuel leak in one of the wing tanks. And the point that they always wanted to make was that the system doesn't have any way to notify you of a fuel leak, or it doesn't have leak detection capability. And what nobody realized was that actually there is leak detection capability built into the system. And the way that it worked, at least in the example that I'll show today, is that if you accept the gauge fuel, in other words, you don't do the pilot input, but you accept gauge fuel as being the correct amount, then the system will constantly compare what's on the gauge versus the fuel as if it were decreasing the sensed fuel flow from the time that the engines have been running. If it sees a difference in FMS fuel weight from the gauge value by more than 2% of the basic operating weight, so in our example here, again, about 350 pounds, then we'll get a message on our PFD that flashes along with a scratch pad message that says compare fuel quantity. And what that's trying to do is to alert us to the fact that there is a difference between what the gauge says and what the FMS thinks we should have, and the possibility of a leak. Notice the last bullet here, that the message is inhibited if you manually enter the fuel as opposed to accepting it from the gauge value. Once we complete the perf init, the next section is perf data, and those pages are generated automatically. Typically, if the airplane is in full perf mode, there'll be 3 perf data pages generated. We're going to talk just briefly about a couple of things that are displayed and what they mean. So beginning at the top of perf data page 1, you'll see a cruise and ceiling altitude. The cruise altitude is obviously the altitude that we put in when we did our perf init. What's interesting is most people don't realize that we can actually change the altitude on this page, and if we do that, it's the same as if we'd gone back in and changed it under perf init, but it'll regenerate new data for us as far as time and fuel to destination. So for the example here, if we're looking at a flight at 290 and we want to check if we'd be better off at 330, we can go ahead and plug that here and see what the differences are just based on time and fuel, and make a decision if we want to do that. The next field where we see ceiling altitude is the highest altitude that the aircraft could maintain at the current speed that was entered, again, when we did our perf init. So if we were planning on flying at Mach 7.5 and it gave us this altitude, then if we slowed that speed down to Mach 7.0, it would generate a higher altitude. So those two numbers are inversely tied together, and hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Estimated time en route and estimated time of arrival are both pretty obvious. Distance. Fuel required is our trip fuel to get from A to B, plus any reserve fuel that we've entered. And if we had an alternate entered, that would be generated on the right-hand side of the arrow. Fuel FOM is a term that stands for fuel figure of merit, and basically this is a number that to the right of the decimal point is hundreds of pounds, and it's the confidence factor the FMS has in its fuel prediction. So in other words, when it says that we need 8.7 for fuel required, that's 8,700 pounds, and then the fuel figure of merit is 0.2 or 200 pounds, saying that it thinks it's accurate within 200 pounds of that number that it's given us. Our fuel remaining should be our fuel left at touchdown, which should include our reserves, provided we didn't burn into it, and then our gross weight. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the takeoff and landing initialization pages. When you do your takeoff init, we have to enter surface winds as a required input. And when we do our landing initialization, we have to enter both temperature and surface winds both as required inputs prior to doing our landing init. One of the questions I've had on several occasions has been if the crew is doing a landing approach, and let's say they're landing to the south with a strong tailwind, and then they're planning on breaking out on the approach and circling around landing to the north, obviously into the wind. If the winds are entered as advertised, because obviously we know we have to load the approach out to the runway that we're shooting the approach to. Since Part 25 aircraft are limited to 10 knots of tailwind, if we try to put more than a 10-knot tailwind in there, the system won't let us confirm that, and it'll give us a message that landing is out of limits. So the basic way to work around this, because the only thing that the system is doing with the winds here is going to calculate head or tailwind and crosswind component, and then it's going to use that to factor our landing distance. So what I recommend to people in that situation, because you really don't have time to change it when you're in the circle, is just put the winds at 0 slant 0, and that way when you circle, you just won't be getting any headwind credit for the landing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We'll talk briefly about another section that is, again, not commonly known about, which is called what-if initialization. The what-if initialization is actually found under the perf menu. And essentially what it is it is another type of a sandbox for perf init. And what I mean by that is if you're in flight and you want to see what change will have as far as impact on the flight, you can go to the what if init, and it gives you a very similar architecture to the perf init pages. You can put in any changes you want and see what the effect will be, and the system will actually generate pages called what if data that we'll look at in a second. And then if you like the changes, you can import that directly into the new perf init and make the change, and if you don't, you can basically just go back to the flight plan and it kicks it out. So here's an example of where to find it using the perf key, and then in this case at 5 left, you'll see what if init. There are 4 what if init pages, and as I mentioned earlier, they'll look very similar to the perf init. At the completion, we'll have an option to select the what if conditions into our active flight plan, and those will replace whatever we did when we did our initial perf init. Afterwards, it'll generate what if data, and again, looking at those pages, they should look very similar to the perf data pages we looked at a few minutes ago. And on both of those pages, we also have the option to select those conditions, and if we do that, it'll allow us to import those into our active perf init, or we can go back and reset it and start the what-if data over if we don't just return to the active flight plan. Here's another small subtlety, but the question comes up a lot, so I want to talk just a moment about it, and it's actually not a missed approach page, but it's a prompt that appears during an approach as we're in the approach phase of flight. What this is, if you'll notice the highlighted blue box where it's next to 6 left where it says missed approach, this will come up at the same time that the approach light would come on if we were doing a GPS approach or just about the point we're 2 miles outside the final approach fix on an ILS or outside the glide slope. And what this was originally intended for was an alternate means to get the aircraft onto the missed approach. For example, if the toga button didn't work, you could select line select key 6 left. And what that would do would be it would remove the discontinuity after the runway or missed approach point and allow the aircraft to continue right on out towards the published mist. When you push that, it would obviously, after removing the discontinuity, it would display the missed approach on the MFD. So a lot of pilots got in the habit of pressing that because they liked the situational awareness of being able to see the missed approach procedure while they were still on the approach. And there obviously was nothing wrong with that. But where it could cause problems is if you are doing an approach that has an RNP requirement, i.e. a GPS approach that has an RNP requirement of 0.3, or even an RNP approach if you have authorization, and you select the missed approach prompt, it now will revert back to terminal requirements, which instead of a 0.3 is a 1.0. And what that means is even though it'll display the missed approach, if we had the approach light on, that will extinguish, and we no longer have the required accuracy to continue on the approach. So the short version is you really don't want to select the missed approach option here, especially if you're on an approach with an RNP 0.3 requirement. We'll move on and talk briefly about the progress pages. These can obviously be accessed by pressing the prog key on the MCDU. The first box you'll see is that the next 2 waypoint in our flight plan is going to be listed next to one left, and it gives us our distance, time, and fuel to get to that point. Below that, we have the next point in our flight plan, again with time, fuel, and distance. And then the third line select, we have our time, fuel, and distance to destination. One of the interesting things about this page is if you want to look at time, fuel, and distance to any other point in your active flight plan, you can make entries next to the to or next point on line select keys 1 left or 2 left. So in other words, you can bounce a waypoint down out of your active flight plan, press the progress key, and then bounce it up to either 1 left or 2 left, and you can view time, fuel, and distance to any other waypoint. If ATC were going to ask you what your estimated time of arrival was at a certain fix that was 3 or 4 waypoints downstream, you could pull that up very quickly by bouncing the point down to your scratch pad, progress key, 1 left or 2 left to view that. However, you can't make any changes next to the destination, as that's always a fixed field. Further down, we'll see the current navigation mode that's being used to determine the FMS position. And so in the example here, that's GPS. In the event that GPS wasn't available or for some reason wasn't accurate, we could also see DME, VOR, DME, DR, or in the event that we had inertial, we could see any of those listed there as well. The next 2 acronyms that you see displayed stand for required navigation performance, which means the accuracy required for the phase of flight or airspace that we're operating in. And next to that, we see EPU for estimated position of uncertainty. So RNP is the requirement, EPU is what we're actually doing. So in other words, we're required to have accuracy within 1 mile, and the estimated position of uncertainty is actually 0.05 miles. So we are operating much more accurately than what the requirement is for that airspace. If at any point the estimated position of uncertainty becomes larger than the required navigation performance, then we'll get a message light on the PFD with an unable RNP message displayed in the scratch pad. Next to 5 left and 5 right are the current nav aids that are being tuned, and then the cyan or blue letter next to that represents whether they're being auto-tuned or remote-tuned, and we touched on that a little bit earlier when we talked about the auto-tuning of the ILS. But essentially, there are 4 modes that can be displayed here. The most prevalent is going to be auto-tune. And again, to get auto-tune enabled, you need to make sure that FMS is displayed on the PFD, and then press the delete key, and then line select either 5 left or 5 right for nav 1 or nav 2 to enable auto-tune. The other symbology that can be displayed here when auto-tune is still enabled is the letter V. And what that means is you have auto-tune selected, but on your PFD, you've selected short-range navigation, i.e. green needles. When you do that, the system assumes you're navigating on short-range navigation, so it doesn't want to change the frequency out from under you because obviously then you don't know what you're navigating to. So it will suspend auto-tuning at that point, and you'll see if you're in green needles, you'll see the letter V displayed there, and that's all that means is that you have VOR displayed or short-range navigation, so auto-tuning is suspended, and as soon as you go back to long-range navigation, that V will change back to an A. Other possibilities there, depending on whether you're tuning through the radio or through another tuning source, would be R or M for remote or manual tune. When auto-tune is enabled, the FMS will automatically select a nearby nav aid, and it will periodically update those nav aids as we progress down our flight plan, and there's no pilot action required. That all happens behind the scenes. At the bottom of progress page 2, we also have menus for RNP and VNAV data. The RNP shows us what the default RNP values are for specific phases of flight, and also the ability next to one left to set a manual RNP value ourselves if we would have a need to do that. On page 3, We see a lot of wind, track, and drift information, but what's highlighted is this is where we have the ability to enter a lateral offset. Lateral offsets can be used for a variety of reasons. They can be used for weather deviations. They can be used internationally for part of slop procedures. But basically, a lateral offset can be entered, and then it will remain active, and the aircraft will deviate in the appropriate direction. And that can be done anytime that we're basically en route, meaning that you'll notice the red bullets at the bottom. It will not accept or it will cancel a lateral offset if we're on a SID, star, approach, holding pattern, terminal area, etc. Lateral offsets can be entered by pressing either an L or an R key and then a mileage, which can be up to 30 nautical miles. And as soon as the offset is entered, the aircraft is going to turn at a 45-degree angle in the direction of the offset, and then it's going to continue until it reaches the mileage that's specified in the offset. You'll also notice that the cross-track error on the other side will show the reciprocal because the original course will still be in the FMS, and so it's going to show a cross-track error, the reciprocal, meaning the opposite of what was entered, and the appropriate mileage. The offset is going to remain valid until we hit any of the conditions that we looked at a moment ago. So the first point on an arrival or an approach would cancel the offset, or if we tried to enter a holding pattern. We can also manually cancel an offset by pressing the delete key and then the offset line at line select key 1 right. An FMS presentation wouldn't be complete without spending some time talking about VNAV, or vertical navigation. So what we're going to do is take the next few minutes and look at the different or various submodes of VNAV operation and hopefully provide a little bit of clarity to VNAV. Basically, on the MCDU, we see VNAV information displayed about 2 places. Progress page 2, we see top of climb and top of descent information, as well as our speed and altitude commands. And some platforms will have a VNAV data page that you'll see the menu for next to 6 right. But we will also see a VNAV profile that is continuously being built in our flight plan on the right-hand side, with each waypoint having a vertical profile assigned to it with either a speed or an altitude constraint. So with VNAV, we essentially have one button, which is the VNAV button, that's going to control multiple submodes of operation, and it's understanding the submodes that's really important here. Let's first focus on modes 1 through 4, because those are the primary things that we're going to deal with when we're talking about VNAV en route. The first one is VFLC, or FLC, which stands for VNAV Flight Level Change. This, again, is a speed mode. And with vertical flight level change, the aircraft is going to pitch for a speed during altitude changes the same way that it would do FLC if we just selected FLC without VNAV being engaged. A couple of things about VFLC that we'll talk about, and then we'll see this reiterated later a few slides down the road. VFLC is the only mode that's used for a climb. In other words, where people have confusion here is we can't define an angle of climb like we can for a descent. So anytime VNAV is engaged in a climb, the submode that will arm automatically will be VFLC, and it will pitch for the appropriate speed in the climb, whatever we've told it in our perfect init. There are a couple of different ways that this can be operated, and I'll give you a couple of examples that will hopefully make sense. The first one is, let's say that we're going to do a departure out of Las Vegas. And the one that comes to mind, there's a Cowboy 2 departure where the procedure says to set flight level 190 in as the altitude. So we would put that in the altitude pre-select for flight level 190. But then there are several crossing restrictions in the procedure at various waypoints along the way. I think one is at 7,000 and one is at 11,000. And for argument's sake, let's say they're both at or below. If we take off and immediately after departure engage VNAV, as I mentioned earlier, we will only climb in VFLC. If the system has the altitude constraints next to the waypoints, then it will automatically see the at or below constraints, and we will see a magenta window that will post that altitude constraint right above the altitude pre-select window on the PFD. So in the screenshot that you see here where it has the cyan 250 indicated, if there was a 7,000-foot constraint, we would see that in magenta right above that, letting us know that that's an altitude constraint coming from the FMS, and the VNAV mode would honor that. So in other words, even though we've set, in this case, 25,000 in, the system will automatically stop until it reaches the waypoint at 7,000. Once it passes that waypoint and that constraint is no longer a requirement, it will automatically continue the climb. When it sees the next altitude constraint, which let's say is at or below 11,000, it'll post that in the window in magenta. It'll level off there, and once it clears that constraint, it'll continue on up to whatever's in the altitude pre-select, in this case 25,000 feet. So that's one way that VFLC can work in a climb mode. Second example, however, is let's assume that we're just doing a departure out of a small airport where we're not on a published SID with an altitude requirement. We can still take off and engage VNAV, and it'll still go into VFilch because VFilch is the only mode that VNAV uses for climbs. In this case, however, let's say ATC gives us a climb up to 5,000 feet. We level at 5. They give us a climb to 10,000, so we reset the altitude pre-select to 10,000, and then they're going to give us another one after 10 up to 15, just for illustration. We will take off, engage VNAV. The submode will be VFLC for the climb, and because the system will always honor the altitude pre-select, it will go into V altitude hold as it levels at 5,000 feet. When ATC comes back and gives us the next clearance up to 10,000, we'll reset the altitude pre-selector to 10,000. And in this case, we're not going to press the VNAV button. We're going to press the FLC button. As long as VNAV is engaged, by pressing FLC, we tell it we want it to continue the climb, and that's the way the system doesn't know that we're authorized to start climbing just because we reset the altitude pre-select. So the way that we tell it that is by pressing the FLC button, and it will still remain in VNAV. So in other words, even though we pressed FLC, the mode that we'll see at the top will be VFLC as long as we continue the climbs. So two different ways to use the VNAV in a climb there. The other submodes that we'll look at, and again, we'll look at these a little more in depth as we go, but VOUT means VNAV is engaged in altitude hold, just the same way that we see altitude hold engaged normally. VACL, same thing, means the system is in VNAV and it is captured to the altitude pre-select. Number 4, VNAV path, or VPath, is one of the modes that we can use for descent. This is done anytime there is a waypoint with an altitude constraint and an angle defined to get to that altitude. Anytime we do that, the system generates what we'll call a glide path or a VPath, and anytime the aircraft crosses one of those VPaths with VNAV engaged and the altitude pre-select set to the appropriate altitude, it will start down on the VPath. If there's no VPath available when we start a descent, or if we're not on the VPath, then the second mode that it'll choose is VFilch, meaning that it'll resort to speed. All of the modes that you see listed, modes 1 through 4, the one thing that they all have in common is every one of them will always honor the altitude pre-select. What that means is, no matter what you do, the system will not in VNAV fly through any altitude that you have set in the altitude pre-selector. It will always stop at that. The difference with Mode 5 is an approach mode for VGP. To activate an approach using GPS, we do it slightly differently, and instead of the VNAV button, we'll use the approach button. But if we're doing a GPS approach with either LNAV VNAV minimums or LPV minimums, anything where we're using a constructed glide path, we'll arm the approach using the approach button. VGP will be our active mode, and in that mode, it's designed to look like an ILS or a precision approach, meaning it will not honor the altitude pre-select. So when we're at the final approach fix, we can go ahead and set our altitude pre-select to the missed approach altitude, arm the approach, and even if the aircraft flies through that pre-selected altitude on its way down to the ground, it's not going to level at the altitude pre-selector due to the VGP being the active mode. Next slide is a busy slide, but it's also important. These are some general rules to VNAV. So, general VNAV rules from the top. First one, FMS must be the selected nav source, and LNAV must be engaged for VPath to be operational. VNAV doesn't function until all perf and NID information has been programmed, which should be part of our normal departure. As mentioned earlier, climbs can only be flown using VFLC. Descents can only be flown, at least en route, using VFLC or VPath. Normal VNAV modes, those modes 1 through 4 that we looked at, will never pass through the altitude pre-selector. Only the VGP will if the VGP is armed. Pilots should set the altitude pre-selector then, since it can never be overridden, only to ATC cleared altitudes. VNAV attempts to keep the aircraft as high as possible, as long as possible. The VPath angles that the system is able to comply with are from 1 to 6 degrees. So in other words, if we set an extremely shallow VPath angle, if we try to do a vertical direct to from 200 miles out and it's a 0.6 degree angle, the system will give us a message that it's unable, that we're under the minimum angle. Or if we try to program an extremely steep descent and it's over 6 degrees, we'll get a scratch pad message telling us the system is unable. Path guidance is always followed during VPath descents, and thus the FMS transitions to a speed mode or a speed reversion. And an example of that would be, let's say that the airplane started down on a descent and we didn't have the power reduced enough, so the aircraft started to overspeed. Rather than allowing the airframe to overspeed, the system will automatically abandon VPath and transition to VFLC, and then will pitch up. So you'll lose the VPath and you won't meet your restriction, but it'll pitch for a speed that will not overspeed the airframe. So it's the lesser of two evils there. Speed protection and latch speed are active in VFLC. If the altitude pre-select is set above or below the current altitude and VNAV is engaged, the FMS commands the autopilot to begin the climb or descent either in VFLC or VPath. The last bullet up here is some parts of the world still use QFE, where they're setting their height above ground level as opposed to sea level. If you happen to be in one of those remote areas, don't use VNAV. So as we mentioned earlier, the VNAV button controls all the submodes. So when we press it, depending on our phase of flight, VNAV will automatically arm the appropriate submode. From that point, the FMS monitors the aircraft position vertically against the altitude pre-select and any altitude constraints that are in that vertical portion of the flight plan, and it determines when to capture. So again, we talked earlier about VFLC. This is a aircraft speed that's controlled by the flight guidance computer and the pitch of the aircraft, also referred to as speed on elevator. Anytime we're in VFLC, we're going to see our speed command next to one right. And again, this is always going to be used in climbs and can be used during descents unless there's a VPath defined. In other words, if there's a glide path that's being generated out there and the aircraft crosses that glide path, it will try to descend in VPath. But if it is not on the VPath, it will default to VFLC instead. Anytime we're in, let's just say, VOut, and we want to transition to VFLC, we can set the altitude pre-select to a higher or a lower altitude, press the FLC button, and it will climb or descend to that new appropriate altitude at the speed that we've entered. As we mentioned earlier, VACL is the same as the altitude capture without VNAV, and the V just reminds us that we have VNAV engaged, and that can be either for an altitude constraint or for the altitude pre-select. Either one will cause us to go into VACL and VOut. So again, VOut mode is the same as altitude hold, just with VNAV engaged. In VPath, the aircraft is controlled along a geometric path. In other words, the system calculates a path to meet whatever the altitude constraint is at a specified angle. And when it is on that path, the indication at the top will be VPath. VPath descents, and although the slide says it's identical to an ILS approach, that's not great wording, but what it means is the vertical guidance is going to work much the same way, that it's going to generate a magenta or FMS-generated glide path, and then provided VNAV is active and the altitude pre-select is set to a lower altitude, it will automatically then couple or capture that vertical glide path and descend down as if it were an ILS on a glide slope. The last mode that we mentioned earlier is VGP, which again stands for Vertical Glide Path. An easy acronym for pilots to remember is that of VGP, think of VNAV goes past the pre-selector. Remember that this is an approach-generated mode for when we're doing an approach to LNAV, VNAV, or LPV minimums if we have WAS capability. This is a VNAV mode that's going to be armed by pressing the approach button. Just like an ILS, they wanted it to look the same with vertical guidance. So we press the approach button with FMS as the nav source, and VGP will be the active mode. It will still track the vertical path the same way it would en route. The only real difference here is that whatever the altitude pre-selector is set to, which should be the missed approach altitude, the system will not honor the altitude pre-select. VGP can be armed, again, when we push the approach button, i.e. clear to the approach, arm the approach, and the following criteria are all met. Obviously, FMS is the selected nav source. This is an important one, though. The nav preview needle cannot be displayed when we do this. In other words, if we turned it on manually, we have to deselect it in order for VGP to be able to be activated. FMS VNAV arm criteria has to be satisfied, meaning we have to have done our perf and knit. It has to be a non-localizer-based approach, i.e. some form of a GPS-type approach. We can't have DR displayed for dead reckoning. The final approach fix or the missed approach point have to be the active waypoint, and we can't do a vertical direct to the final approach fix. VGP mode will become the active mode when LNAV is active. There has to be a descent path to the missed approach point, and the FMS has internally set VPath, meaning it's following the vertical track angle down. But don't confuse that. VGP will never stop at the altitude pre-select, whatever it's set to. So again, just a basic recap. All VNAV climbs are flown using VFLC. If we're flying a departure with altitude constraints, the system will automatically level the airplane to honor the constraints, and once those are cleared, it will automatically continue the climb towards whatever the altitude is that's in the altitude pre-select. In the event that we're doing a VNAV climb without altitude constraints in the flight plan, i.e. we're doing ATC cleared altitudes, then again, we can still climb in VFilch. And in the example here, if we have 10,000 set in the altitude pre-select and we can see it in the window, the system will level and go into V out when it reaches 10,000 feet. If ATC clears us to 15,000, we're going to reach over, select 15,000 with the altitude pre-select, and press FLC to get the aircraft to continue climbing in VFilch. Again, descents can be flown basically using VFilch or VPath as appropriate, or on approach using VGP. The transition to the descent is automatic, assuming that you set the altitude pre-selector to a lower altitude. 1 minute before we reach the top of descent, we'll have a vertical track alert, which will be the little chime along with an amber VTA indication. And then once we reach the top of descent point, the VNAV will either start the descent in VPath, provided it's captured the angle, or if there's not an angle defined or we start down either early or late, it'll do it in VFilch. If there's not an altitude specified during a descent and we just select a lower altitude, if there are no altitude constraints, the aircraft will default to using VFilch in absence of a defined path. In this case, the top of descent is calculated to place the aircraft 1,500 feet above the destination 10 miles prior, and the top of descent is based on any speed constraints in the descent, such as slowing to 250 by 10,000 feet. VPath descent is flown when there is an altitude constraint in the descent portion of the flight plan. The path angle associated with the constraint is either a default angle computed by the FMS, i.e. a 3-degree descent angle to reach an altitude, or something specified by a procedure or pilot entered, i.e. ATC gives us a crossing restraint at a certain waypoint of 15,000 feet. If we pass the last waypoint with an altitude constraint in VPath and we're still continuing our descent to a lower altitude, then the system will transition from VPath back to VFilch and continue descending in speed. Again, LNAV must be the selected lateral mode of navigation for VPath to be able to be commanded by the FMS. Anytime that we have a path descent, meaning if we put an altitude constraint on a waypoint, the system will automatically try to cross that at whatever angle we've accepted in the perf init when we did our descent speeds and angle, which will normally be a 3-degree descent. The other option is if we do a vertical direct to, in other words, we press the direct key and line select one of the altitudes on the right-hand side of the MCDU, then the system will generate whatever the current altitude is from our present position to get to that altitude. In the case of what you see on the screen now, that would be a 2.8-degree angle to cross Yardley at 8,900 feet. So VPath is always going to be displayed on the MCDU in terms of an angle when it is going to descend using VPath. Anytime that we are descending on VFilch, whether we started down early or late, if we converge or cross a VPath-generated angle, the system will automatically transition from VFilch to VPath and continue descending on the vertical path. So we'll look at a couple of examples. The first example, starting at the top, we're at an altitude. We reach our top of descent, reset the altitude to a lower pre-select, and assuming that the angle is between 1 and 6 degrees, which are our tolerances, if VNAV is engaged, we've reset the altitude to a lower point, the system will automatically capture the vertical path and will descend in VPath to our new lower altitude. Let's take a look at a case where we'll say we're given a late descent from ATC, and in this case, we're at our original altitude. We're expecting a step down or a crossing restriction to a lower altitude, but we pass our top of descent point, which is where the FMS calculated where we should have began our descent, and somewhere past that, ATC gives us a descent down to that new lower altitude. We're going to reset the altitude pre-selector to the lower altitude, and in this case, we're going to press the FLC button to initiate the descent. So we'll go from V out to VFilch, and you'll notice the dashed lines, and the dashed lines represent the aircraft descending in VFilch, which is, again, a speed mode. And if the rate of descent that we produce as a result of that happens to coincide with the vertical path that we already missed because of the late step down, then it will automatically transition to VPath and then make the normal altitude level off with ACEL and V out. We'll talk about a VPath early descent using direct to, and an example of this could be we may be given a pilot's discretion descent to cross a waypoint further down the road where we may want to stay up higher longer, or maybe if we've got strong headwinds, we want to start down earlier. We can push the direct key and, again, line select the lower altitude that we set in the altitude pre-selector. And now, instead of descending at the top of descent, the FMS will recalculate the path requirement from the aircraft's present position to meet the altitude constraint at the next waypoint. The same thing can also work on a late descent, that if we have passed our top of descent point and ATC gives us a lower altitude, again, we have to reset the altitude pre-select, and instead of now starting down in V-Felch and hoping we converge with the V-path, we can do a vertical direct to the next altitude, and provided we're still less than 6 degrees to get there, the aircraft will recenter the needle on V-path, and we'll go ahead and start down at whatever that new steeper angle is. Altitude constraints that we're going to see in SID stars or approach procedures should be in the nav database, or the pilot can enter them directly into the flight plan. FMS predicted altitudes will appear in the vertical portion of the flight plan in small font. Procedural altitude constraints will appear on the active flight plan pages and be pulled from the database. Those or pilot-entered constraints will appear in cyan, but they'll be in large font as an indication that they are procedural or pilot-entered constraints. The FMS basically plans every flight that the first half of it is spent in the climb, and the second half of it assumes is going to be done in a descent profile. So you'll notice at the beginning of the flight plan, you may see the letter CLB for climb or DES for descent, telling you which phase of flight that it's in. The pilot can make an overriding entry. It isn't accurate. So, for example, if it's showing a descent maybe on a short flight and the pilot still thinks the airplane is going to be in a climb, you can input the letter C and line select it over top of the line select key with the climb or descent on it in order to make an overriding input. We'll move on and talk a little bit about temporary waypoints. There are 4 different types of temporary waypoint conventions. The first one is place bearing distance, and we'll call that PBD. The second one is place distance, meaning that it's going to assume either our inbound or outbound course. And so essentially what we've done is just used 2 slants in the format and left the bearing blank. The third format is what's called a place bearing, all separated with a slant. And then the fourth type of a temporary waypoint, we can enter something specifically based on lat and long. When we're talking about temporary waypoints and we enter a temporary waypoint, and the example here we'll see is a place bearing distance in blue with Memphis, the 120 bearing, and 45 miles. When we put that into the active flight plan, in this case next to 3 left, you'll notice that the system retitles it with an asterisk, and it puts the format in there PBD for place bearing distance, and then the number 1, meaning that it's the first one in the flight plan, the first temporary waypoint. One thing that you can also do in this case is you can actually input the place bearing distance along with another slant and put an altitude constraint all in one line select. So in other words, if we wanted to go ahead and put the Memphis 120 radial, 45 miles, cross it at flight level 410, we can enter all of that as one line select entry, selected up next to L3, and it'll put in the place bearing distance temporary waypoint along with the altitude constraint all in one input. The next type we'll talk about is what's called a place bearing. An example of that is if you had to cross, let's say, and this is rare, but it happens, 2 different airways that cross without a named intersection there, and you want to be able to input that. You can do that using a place bearing format where you use the identifier and radial from one VOR, the identifier and radial from another VOR to define a temporary waypoint or a fix for that. And in this case, we're looking at the Little Rock 050 radial and the Memphis 300 radial, and where those intersect, we're basically going to create a point. The next type, or the last type, is lat long, and basically this is not real common over domestic operations, but for international procedures and crossings, this is a common entry, and you'll notice in this case the format that's listed for how lat longs can be entered, and again, lat longs can be entered with crossing restrictions, all with one input. The FMS can also create temporary waypoints such as runway extensions, and that can be done either with a departure runway or for the arrival runway. And this is a really slick little trick that can be done. For example, if you wanted to extend the center line of a runway on departure, you can just press the line select key next to the origin runway. So in this case, we're at Dallas-Fort Worth, runway 35 left. If we press that, it will automatically select that into the scratch pad along with the departure bearing of the runway and a slant, and then all we have to do is type in how many miles we want the extended center line to go out. For example, if we wanted a 10-mile extended center line, we would just type in the number 10 and line select it right after the runway, and it would then insert that as an extended center line or another waypoint 10 miles out using the runway bearing. This also works for the arrival. So, for example, if you're going into an airport visually, maybe it's not set up for an approach or doesn't have an approach to a particular runway, and you want to put an extended center line, you can go to the load the runway, line selected to the scratch pad, and the same logic will work, that it'll bring the runway bearing in. You can put a slant 5 miles, put it right back over top of the landing runway, and it'll build a 5-mile extended center line to the landing runway. The last one is a flight plan modification, which is a radial outbound to intercept an airway. This is a fairly lengthy input, but again, it's an uncommon thing that there's not a lot of familiarity with. But the example here, ATC clearance requires the pilot to fly a radial outbound from a nav aid to intercept another airway. The intercept point may not be contained in a published airway, so the entry format is where you want to start, the bearing, the airway, and then where you're going to end the airway at. The FMS then computes the distance from the start waypoint to the point that the airway is going to be intercepted by the radial, and it puts a point bearing distance there. So the example you see in the scratch pad means that we're going to fly the 320 radial from the PTW VOR until we intercept Victor 276. We're going to continue on Victor 276 on the airway until we reach Romeo Alpha Victor. If the radial that we enter in there to fly doesn't intercept, the FMS is going to give us a message saying there's no crossing point found in the scratch pad. The next topic we're not going to go into great detail on in this webinar because I just think that it's going to be too much information, but I want to mention it anyway, and that's the topic of crossing points, equal time points, and point of no return. The FMS, through the crossing points menu or cross points menu, gives us the ability to do multiple types of computations, and you'll see those all listed here on the screen. We can calculate the current bearing and distance if we were to go direct to a point from our aircraft position. We can determine our point of beam, a waypoint, a crossing radial, crossing lat long, but we can also determine an equal time point between any two given waypoints and a point of no return from a waypoint. You can find the crossing points menu through the nav index, and you'll see the cross points that's highlighted there. And for more information on that, you can reference the appropriate pilot guide for your flight management system. The last topic I want to touch on today, and this is a really simple one, but again, I get calls occasionally when people say, well, why is it if ATC sends us direct to a fix that cuts 6 waypoints down out of our flight plan, and then the next controller gives us back direct to a previous fix, why is it we've lost all those waypoints? And so I want to remind everyone out there that may not be familiar that we do have a recovery function on that, and that is through what's called the direct previous key. So, for example, we're all used to the idea that we can go direct to a waypoint. Let's say that ATC gives us direct to waypoint number 6 in our flight plan, and we go ahead and go direct to waypoint number 6, and we've lost the previous 5. We get handed off, and the next controller says, go back to direct to waypoint number 3. Well, we have a way that we can do that, and that is we press the direct key, and then instead of pressing the next to go down through waypoints, we can go previous. And you'll notice the screenshot in the slide, and instead of having a page 1, we can actually go to page -1, -2, etc. And the system stores a previously set number of waypoints in the flight plan, so we can go back direct to a previous waypoint, and it will import all the subsequent waypoints right back directly into our flight plan.
That's the end of the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining in.